A grieving sound engineer returns to a dying Kansas town to sell an abandoned AM radio station until his 13-year-old son finds an unlabeled tape that says his name from years before he was born. Welcome to Deb's Story Haven. Before we begin, comment which city you're watching from. And when the story ends, rate it from 0 to 10 and tell us what you felt. If you love emotional stories with storms, secrets, and second chances, follow Deb's Story Haven so you don't miss the next one. Now, let's begin. Leo Hartwell didn't hear the phone ring the first 2 times. It was only after the red light blinked for the 3rd time that he stepped away from the mixing bay and into the hallway, half expecting it to be a client with new instructions or an artist complaining about vocal levels. The call came through sharp and clinical, his lawyer's assistant, voice wrapped in detached sympathy, informing him that his Aunt Edda had passed away peacefully 2 nights ago. Leo blinked twice, the name stirring something faint but familiar in his chest. Edda hadn't been part of his life for nearly 20 years, and yet he felt the loss like a hairline fracture catching air. The woman on the phone continued, saying something about property, land, a structure, a legal designation, until the words radio station made Leo turn his back to the hallway wall and sink slightly. It wasn't just land. It was that station. That strange little AM tower on the edge of nowhere, Kansas, where he'd spent blurry childhood summers being scolded for touching cables and eavesdropping on Edda's late-night broadcasts. And now it was his. Inheriting it felt less like a gift and more like a summons, one he hadn't realized he'd been avoiding. When he told Mika, his 13-year-old son, the news over drive-through fries later that evening, the boy barely reacted. "So we have to go?" Mika asked, voice flat, eyes on the greasy paper bag he kept folding and unfolding between his fingers. Leo nodded, pretending to focus on a text from his agent. "Just for a few days. Sign some things, make a few calls, and we're out." Mika gave a tiny shrug, the kind that said he didn't care enough to resist, but still wished Leo would change his mind. And maybe that was what stung the most, that Mika didn't argue, didn't complain, didn't even ask if it meant missing school. Since the funeral, since the hospital, since her, Mika had drifted into a quiet so dense, Leo could barely touch it. The father he wanted to be, present, alert, open, had drowned in the noise of grief, both his and Mika's. This trip was a distraction wrapped in necessity. Leo told himself it was about closing loops, but deep down, he knew it was just another way to run. He told Mika they'd stay in a motel. He didn't mention the money yet. The drive across the state pulled the silence between them taut. Every few hours, Leo would offer up a comment about the clouds or the horizon or the station's strange history, hoping Mika would pick up the thread. The boy never did. He kept his headphones in, face turned toward the window, like he was watching another life play out in the fields beyond. Leo remembered taking this road when he was 11, 14, 17, each time aching to be anywhere else. That part hadn't changed. The towns along the highway looked like they were waiting to be buried, their storefronts peeling, their gas pumps rusted into statues. A part of him felt smug for having escaped, for building a life elsewhere. Another part, the one that tightened every time Mika shifted away from him, wondered what he had really escaped to. He thought of Edda behind the microphone, her gravelly voice a lifeline to night owls and misfits. She'd never left. And now she was gone, leaving behind a puzzle Leo hadn't asked to solve. They arrived just past sundown. The radio station emerged from the distance like an old scar, familiar, unsightly, and too stubborn to disappear. It sat off a forgotten county road, the grass grown tall around its base, the boards over the windows weathered but intact. Mika climbed out of the car first, stretching his legs with the stiff caution of a boy growing faster than he wanted. Leo stayed by the driver's side, looking at the building and feeling something unnameable crawl beneath his ribs. It wasn't nostalgia. It was something heavier, more personal, like being recognized by a place that shouldn't have remembered him. He stepped forward slowly, the gravel crunching under his boots, and glanced back to find Mika already walking toward the front steps, his backpack slung low, shoulders hunched, not with boredom, but resignation. Leo sighed and followed, pulling the keys from his jacket. They felt oddly warm in his hand, as if the building had been expecting them. Inside, the air was thick and dry, carrying the scent of paper, metal, and a history too old to be cleaned. The front room was mostly intact, dusty, cluttered, but untouched by vandalism. It had the eerie tidiness of a place prepared for a return that never came. Leo stood in the main lobby, staring at the framed photos that lined the far wall. Edda, with headphones too big for her face, smiling with a kind of defiance. He remembered that look. She wore it when the mayor tried to shut down her overnight shows. She wore it when his father stopped visiting. Mika wandered past him without a word, exploring deeper into the building, fingers trailing lightly over forgotten furniture. Leo thought of calling him back, of warning him not to touch anything, but stopped. What would be the point? He was a stranger here too. This place didn't need instructions, it needed understanding, and Leo wasn't sure he had any to give. He took one last look at the silent control booth, the dead soundboard covered with a drop cloth, like a corpse no one dared examine. This wasn't going to be simple. This wasn't going to be quick. The idea of calling Voss and accepting the offer, sight unseen, tempted him more now than ever. The man had sounded efficient, almost overly eager. "We're interested in repurposing the land," he'd said. "You'll walk away with enough to start fresh, for you and your son." But as Leo stood there, watching Mika disappear down a hallway in a building filled with the echoes of things unsaid, he realized something unsettling. Maybe this wasn't about starting fresh. Maybe this was about facing what he'd left buried. Still, he forced himself to play the role. "2 nights tops," he muttered under his breath, mostly to himself. "Sign papers, sell, leave." The words hung in the air like promises already breaking. The station loomed ahead of him, waiting, not to welcome, but to be reckoned with. Leo stepped deeper into the station, like someone picking their way through an old argument, careful, reluctant, and already exhausted. The place hadn't been touched in years. That much was clear. Everything felt brittle, the chairs, the cords, even the air itself, thick with the stale scent of old tobacco and something sharper underneath, like burned tape. He moved methodically, like a man wearing gloves over his past, as if touching anything too directly might pull him backward into a version of himself he'd long tried to forget. He began peeling away the warped plywood that covered the inside of the control room window, each creak of the wood sharp enough to make him flinch. Every board he removed revealed more of the space he remembered only in fractured pieces. His aunt hunched over the mic, a cigarette smouldering in a cracked dish, her voice steady even when the world felt like it was unraveling. He stepped over a knot of cables coiled like veins and reached for the light switch, but nothing happened. Figures, he thought. No power, no heat, just layers of dust sitting on old equipment like ash on a grave. He turned to call for Mika, but the boy was already gone, swallowed into the deeper halls of the station. Mika hadn't said much since they arrived. He'd stood quietly in the entryway, taking in the room with a slow glance, like he was waiting for something, or someone, to emerge from the shadows. And then, without a word, he drifted away from Leo, avoiding the main booth entirely. The boy's steps were light, but there was nothing hesitant about them. He didn't look afraid, he looked drawn. Leo let him go, only half aware of the ache that settled in his chest as he watched his son walk toward the back rooms. Maybe it was better that way. Mika had always been like this, quiet, self-contained, the kind of kid who didn't need noise to express how far away he felt. After the funeral, it had only gotten worse. Leo told himself Mika was coping in his own way, but it never stopped feeling like he was losing him a little more each day. He turned back to the mixing board and ran his hands across the sliders, brushing aside layers of dust. The equipment was old, sure, but it had bones. Edda had once called this console her altar. Leo smirked faintly. Only she would talk about analog gear like it was holy. The vibration in his pocket startled him. He pulled out his phone, expecting a text from the motel or a notification about missed emails. Instead, it was a call, unknown number, but the area code looked vaguely familiar. He answered with a terse hello and immediately regretted it. "Mr. Hartwell," came the voice, smooth and rehearsed like a man who practiced sounding confident in mirrors. "This is Evan Voss. I represent Heartland Redevelopment. I believe we corresponded briefly last week regarding the property you've inherited." Leo sighed quietly and stepped into the hallway for better reception. "Yeah, I remember." Voss's voice didn't falter. "Great. I just wanted to follow up. We're very interested in the location, strategic value, existing infrastructure, proximity to Route 17. We think it has excellent repurposing potential." Leo frowned. "It's an old radio station. There's nothing strategic about it unless you're buying ghost stories." Voss chuckled. "I assure you, Mr. Hartwell, our team sees opportunity where others see decay. We're prepared to offer a very competitive rate for a direct sale, no agent involved. You walk away with cash and peace of mind." Leo looked back down the hall. Mika hadn't come back. "I'll think about it," he said, then hung up before Voss could lock him into more words. As he wandered deeper into the station, following the direction Mika had taken, the corridors felt tighter, like they'd been holding in breath for years. He found the boy in the archive room, down on one knee, in front of a low shelving unit filled with old boxes. Mika wasn't just rummaging. He was handling. His fingers moved with a kind of reverence that Leo hadn't seen since before everything went wrong. The kid was reading labels, brushing dust off with his sleeve, squinting at faded names scrawled in Edda's jagged handwriting. "What are you doing?" Leo asked, trying to keep his voice even. Mika didn't look up. "There are dates. These are from, like, decades ago. Some of these have names. Callers." Leo stepped closer. "Edda recorded everything. She used to say no one deserved to be forgotten just because they were lonely." Mika nodded absently and pulled out a cassette with a cracked case. His thumb hovered over the tape like it was something fragile, something sacred. Leo watched him and felt something shift. Guilt, maybe, or a memory he didn't know he still carried. There was a stillness in Mika that wasn't boredom. It was connection, the kind that doesn't happen by accident. "You don't have to go through all of that," Leo said, softer this time. "We're not staying." Mika finally looked at him. "Why not?" It wasn't a challenge. It was a question, plain and devastating. "Because this place isn't ours," Leo replied, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Mika looked down again, running his fingers along the tape's edge. "It was hers, and now it's yours." Leo didn't have an answer for that, not one he was ready to say out loud. He thought about Voss's voice in his ear, about the zeros on the contract waiting in his inbox. That money could mean a new apartment, a fresh city, a better school, maybe even a therapist for Mika if he ever agreed to go. But watching him now, knees on the cracked linoleum, surrounded by remnants of lives that once reached out across the static, it didn't feel like a place to escape. It felt like a story waiting to be reopened. "Come on," Leo said with a sigh that tried to be firm but came out tired. "Let's not get lost in nostalgia." Mika didn't move. "I don't think this is nostalgia," he said quietly. "I think it's something else." Leo stood in the doorway longer than he meant to. He watched his son carefully set one tape aside, then another, building a small stack as if curating a playlist only he could understand. There was a rhythm to Mika's choices, a curiosity Leo hadn't seen in a long time, not since before the hospital stays, before the slow goodbyes. He could have insisted they stop. He could have reminded Mika of their plan: 2 days, sign papers, sell, leave. Instead, he found himself lingering. There was something sobering about watching a boy search through voices that existed before he was born, like he was digging for something more permanent than grief. Leo reached out, then pulled his hand back before touching Mika's shoulder. He had no idea how to explain the sudden knot forming in his chest, so instead he did what he'd done for years. He turned around, walked back to the main booth, and sat behind the console like he used to as a teenager when Edda was on air. Only this time, the dust on the microphones didn't feel like a nuisance. It felt like proof that something had once lived here, that maybe somehow it still did. Night fell like a curtain dropped too early, swallowing what was left of the sun before Leo even realized the sky had changed. Inside the station, the darkness felt dense, not terrifying, not unnatural, just thick with memory. With the power still unreliable, they moved through the space with the kind of quiet that only happens when 2 people are choosing not to speak. Leo busied himself near the control booth, pretending to sort through coiled cords and dead batteries, but mostly he was waiting. Waiting for Mika to resurface from wherever he had vanished to in the archives, and maybe, if he was being honest, waiting to feel something other than the dull, grinding ache that had settled in his chest since they'd arrived. Then he heard the footsteps, light, deliberate, and turned just as Mika appeared in the doorway. The boy said nothing. He simply walked forward and placed a cassette on the table beside the soundboard. It had no label, no date, nothing to mark it except the slight clouding of its plastic shell. Mika looked at him once, directly, as if daring him to press play, and then he stepped back, folded his arms, and waited. Leo stared at the tape like it might bite. Leo had spent his entire adult life controlling sound. That was what he did: equalize, compress, strip away the noise until only clarity remained. But now, faced with this unlabeled tape, his fingers hovered over the controls like a man uncertain if the switch he was about to flip might set off an alarm. Something about it felt too intentional, too placed, not random, not lost. He glanced at Mika again, then at the console. "You sure?" he asked, though the question was more for himself. Mika didn't reply. Leo pressed the button, and the reel began to turn. At first there was nothing, just the familiar hiss of analog silence, but then came the voice, Aunt Edda's voice. Not a whisper, not filtered through static or warped by time. Just her, warm and sharp, like she was still sitting in the room next to them, with a mic in one hand and a lit cigarette in the other. "If you're listening to this," she began, "then it means the station's still standing. Good. This place is stubborn like me." Leo blinked hard, his throat tightening before he could explain it. Mika leaned forward, entranced. Edda continued, her words meandering like she was in no rush to be heard. She spoke of late nights when the phones would ring and the wind howled against the walls. "You could always tell when a storm was coming," she said, "not because of the forecast, but because the calls would change. The voices would get shaky. People confess more in the dark, especially when they think no one's really listening." Leo let the words wash over him, not sure if he was angry or grateful. Edda hadn't left a will. She'd left a broadcast. Her monologue didn't follow a structure. It wandered, digressed, circled back. She talked about loneliness like it was a common cold. Everyone caught it eventually. Some people never quite got over it. Mika didn't speak, but he wasn't looking at the tape deck anymore. He was looking at Leo. The boy's eyes held questions he hadn't yet formed. Edda's voice lowered then, as if leaning closer to the mic. "We keep the lights on here, even when no one's calling, because sometimes people just need to know they can call." Leo felt the weight of that land on him like truth. Then came the shift, a pause. The audio dipped for a moment, followed by a breath that wasn't hers. Another voice entered, male, quiet, younger. There was hesitation in it, like the speaker was unsure he had permission to be there. The voice cracked on the first word. "This is... I don't know if this will even get saved." He laughed nervously, the sound brittle. Edda said it's okay to say something. She said I should, even if it's stupid." Leo leaned forward involuntarily, his heart thudding harder than he wanted to admit. "I don't really know you yet, but—" "Your name's Mika. Edda told me." Leo froze. Mika sat up straighter, every part of him suddenly alert. "You're going to be born next year and I won't be around, but I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, and I hope you like music. That's all." The voice broke again, softer now. "Tell your mom I'm sorry too." A second of silence. Then, click, the tape cut off, abrupt, no closure, no signature, just the sharp end of something unfinished. Leo's hand hovered over the deck, not sure whether to rewind or destroy it. He didn't know how long they sat like that. The silence stretched between them, not empty but full, dense with all the things neither of them could articulate yet. Leo's mind raced, trying to match the voice to a face, a name. It didn't sound like any of his old friends. It wasn't him, and he was certain it wasn't his brother. There had been no mention of anyone else, just him, Mika, and his wife. God, her. Could she have known? Had she kept secrets from him, or had Edda orchestrated this whole thing, preserving a voice she thought Mika would need someday? Leo's hands were shaking. "What was that?" Mika asked, his voice low. "I don't know," Leo said. He meant it. He didn't know, but he also couldn't lie. Not anymore. "I think someone wanted you to hear that, before it was too late." Mika looked down, his jaw tight. Too late for what? And Leo had no answer. There was no clean answer. Just the ache of unfinished words and the sting of being spoken to by a stranger who somehow knew your name before you even existed. The tape sat between them like a wound. When Leo finally stood, he felt something buckle inside him. Not collapse, not entirely, but a tilt, a shift. The kind of quiet unraveling that doesn't scream, but leaves you different. Mika picked up the cassette and turned it in his hands, like it might reveal something more if he stared hard enough. "Can we listen again?" he asked, surprising Leo. He hesitated, but nodded. "Yeah, we can." But he didn't move toward the console just yet. His body was still rooted in the moment, trying to find the pieces of who that voice might belong to. And then, as Mika carefully placed the tape back on the desk, Leo finally saw it. Not just the tape, not just the voice, but what it meant. He hadn't just inherited property or relics. He had inherited something unfinished, something raw, something impossible to sell or silence. As they both sat back down in front of the machine, the static whisper of the end of the reel still humming, it became clear that the past hadn't come to haunt them. It had come to speak. And now it was Leo's turn to listen. Leo was out the door before Mika had even stirred, though he doubted the boy had actually slept much. The night before kept looping in his head. The voice on the tape, Mika's question, the sharp ache of unfinished things. He walked the few blocks into town like he had a map drawn in instinct, not memory. The streets hadn't changed much. Time had worn them thin, not redesigned them. His first stop was the diner, where the coffee still tasted like desperation and burnt hope. He slid into a booth and nodded at the waitress, who paused just long enough to squint at him. "You're one of hers," she said finally. "The woman on the hill, radio lady." Leo nodded once, and she brought him a cup without asking what he wanted. As he drank, he listened. To the scraping of forks, to the muttered conversations, to the way his name wasn't said, but circled. When he paid, a man near the register touched his arm lightly and said, "She saved me once, just by answering the phone." The man didn't explain further. He didn't have to have. Leo left with more questions than answers, and a hollow he hadn't come in with. Next was the hardware store. Less because he needed anything, and more because he remembered it being the kind of place where truths slipped out when you weren't asking for them. The bell over the door rang, and an older man behind the counter looked up, stared for a beat too long, then gave a gruff nod. "Hartwell," he said, like the name was a splinter lodged somewhere inconvenient. "You come to take her away, or bring her back?" Leo didn't know what to say, so he just asked, "You knew Edda?" The man snorted. "Knew her, argued with her, owed her money once. She was like weather, couldn't ignore her, couldn't stop her." Leo smiled faintly, and the man softened. "She kept tapes, you know. Everything. Said if a voice wasn't remembered, it might as well not have existed. Gave people proof they mattered." Leo nodded slowly. "Did she ever talk about a man named Calder?" The name had surfaced in his memory like an oil slick. The man's eyes narrowed. Calder was trouble. Didn't belong anywhere, but thought he could fit in by clinging to ghosts. You steer clear of that name. Leo thanked him and left, but Calder clung to him like smoke. The sun was climbing higher when he passed Maribel's porch, and she was already out there like she'd been waiting. She had the kind of face time forgets to wrinkle, but her eyes were sharp, observant. "You're walking heavy, Leander," she said, before he even opened his mouth. "Like your aunt used to when she carried too many stories at once." Leo almost smiled. "I've got questions." Maribel waved him onto the porch like she'd known he'd come. "You're not the only one." They sat in silence for a moment, and then Leo asked, "Why did she keep all those recordings?" Maribel looked out at the street, thoughtful. "Because she believed that when someone's voice is gone, the world gets quieter in places it shouldn't. She didn't want people to vanish quietly." Leo nodded, absorbing the weight of that. "And Calder?" Maribel's face tightened. "That name's a cut, not a person. He tried to become something he wasn't, left wreckage, but Edda, she never erased him, said even ghosts deserve to be heard, just not followed." That sat heavy on Leo's chest. He didn't know what he'd been hoping for, maybe something simpler, cleaner. But here, nothing ever seemed to come without contradiction. By the time he returned to the station, the sky had shifted, and the building looked smaller somehow, as if it had exhaled in his absence. He expected to find Mika still curled up in a corner, headphones on, buried in tapes. Instead, he stepped into the control room and stopped short. Mika was already at the console, sleeves rolled up, fingers stained with dust and old grease. The kid was cleaning knobs with the kind of focus most teenagers reserved for video games. His brows were furrowed, tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. Leo stood in the doorway, unsure whether to interrupt or retreat. Finally, he stepped forward and said, "You don't have to do that. None of this is going anywhere." Mika didn't even glance up. "So? That doesn't mean it's worthless." Leo sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "This whole station is falling apart, kid. The signal's dead. The building's barely holding." Mika looked up then, really looked, and his voice was calm but firm. "Then why did someone leave me a message?" Leo had no answer, and somehow that was worse than being wrong. It wasn't just what Mika said, it was how he said it. Not with defiance, not with anger, but with genuine curiosity, like he wanted to understand something bigger than either of them. Leo met his son's eyes, and for the first time in months, felt like they were standing in the same room emotionally, not just physically. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. What could he even say? That he didn't believe in signs, but was starting to think he might be standing in one. That he still didn't know how to be a good father without a script. He sat down next to Mika slowly, watching as the boy resumed cleaning the soundboard. "You really think it means something?" he asked quietly. Mika shrugged. "I think it mattered to someone. That should count for something." The words were simple, but they landed hard. Leo looked at his hands, then at the tape player, then back at Mika. The boy wasn't just reaching for nostalgia, he was reaching for connection, for answers, for a signal in the static, and maybe Leo realized so was he. They worked side by side for a while without talking. There was something sacred in the silence, an unspoken agreement that neither of them needed to fill the air with excuses or apologies just yet. Eventually, Mika wiped his hands on his jeans and said, "You think the signal still works?" Leo hesitated. "Maybe. Might need parts, repairs, a miracle." Mika just nodded as if that was acceptable. The moment stretched, and then Leo placed a hand gently on Mika's shoulder. "You did good today," he said. The boy didn't flinch or shrug it off. He just looked at his father and said, "You too." It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't a breakthrough, but it was something. And for them, something was everything. In that shared breath, in that small look of acknowledgement, Leo felt something crack open. Not pain, not guilt, just the possibility of building forward. As they turned back to the console, the tools between them, the dust on their hands, Leo understood what he had missed all along. He hadn't come back to bury a legacy. He had come back to uncover one. By morning, they began with a screwdriver and silence. It was Leo who broke it first, not with small talk, but with instruction. "First rule," he said, handing Mika a tool that looked older than both of them. "Signal follows logic. If you can't find it, trace it backward." Mika gave a nod, eyes narrowed in concentration. Leo pointed to a nest of wires behind the console, explaining how the signal chain moved, from mic to mixer to transmitter, then back again. Mika barely spoke, but he listened, really listened, in a way that made Leo's chest ache. He wasn't used to being watched like this by his son, not with trust, not with curiosity. As they pulled open panels and replaced warped fuses, something unspoken passed between them. This wasn't just repair work. This was translation. Mika wasn't asking questions about the tape, about the voice, about why they were still there. He was asking how to build. And maybe this was the first time since the funeral that Leo didn't feel like an intruder in his own son's world. Every wire they connected felt like a sentence rebuilt. Not forgiveness yet, but fluency. And Leo, who had made a career out of cleaning sound, finally let the static sit for a while. Later, Leo sent Mika on a supply run to the convenience store 2 blocks down. The kid needed air, and Leo needed a minute alone. He returned to the control booth, half thinking about wiring and voltage, and opened a drawer looking for spare XLR connectors. What he found instead stopped him cold. A stack of yellowing notepads in Edda's handwriting, crammed with tight rows of notes. Most were labeled like broadcast logs, dates, callers, weather patterns. But tucked between the pages were sentences that weren't meant for the public. They were more like confessions or mantras. "Don't let the lonely talk into the dark," one said. Another read, "Everyone breaks. Sometimes the mic is the only place left to say it." Then, beneath a folded index card, a short note addressed to him. "You always ran. Try staying when it hurts." Leo read it twice, 3 times. His throat tightened. It wasn't an accusation, it was a mirror. He crumpled it in his fist at first, angry at the truth of it. But after a long minute, he smoothed it out again and slid it into his back pocket. Not to keep, not yet, but not to throw away either. When Mika returned, Leo didn't say anything about the note. Instead, he got back to work, showing the kid how to test the old potentiometers with a multimeter. Mika caught on faster than he expected. "You've done this before?" Leo asked casually. Mika shook his head. "Just makes sense." Leo didn't push. The work moved on like a rhythm neither of them wanted to break. They joked, even if the jokes were quiet. At one point, Mika smeared black dust across his cheek, and Leo pointed it out with a smirk. "You look like a war painter," he said. "Maybe I am," Mika replied, not missing a beat. It wasn't laughter, not quite, but it was ease. It was closeness without the pressure of naming it. And Leo, for the first time in a long time, didn't feel like he was failing. He felt like he was showing up. Not fixing things to be a hero, not rebuilding the station to redeem himself, but just being there, in the thick of something real, something his son could lean into. The repairs weren't about electricity. They were about voltage of another kind, a fragile current of trust, flickering but undeniable. In the late afternoon, the moment of peace cracked. Voss returned unannounced, stepping into the booth with polished shoes and practiced ease, as if he already owned the place. "Mr. Hartwell," he said with that same rehearsed calm, "I brought the paperwork." Leo didn't stand, didn't offer a chair. Mika stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching. "We can keep it clean and quick," Voss continued. "This place is beyond viable use. You walk away with enough to start fresh, get your son into better schools, out of a dying town." Leo stared at the man, the offer, the folders with their tidy tabs and hidden meanings, and for a long moment he considered it. The pen was there. Voss even placed it on top like a loaded weapon, and Leo picked it up. It felt like surrender disguised as progress. Mika didn't speak. He didn't interrupt. Instead, he walked across the room and gently placed the unlabeled cassette, that cassette, beside the contract. He didn't say anything, didn't even look at Voss, but the click of the plastic hitting the table sounded louder than a slammed door. Leo looked at the tape, then at his son. The pen never touched paper. Voss, to his credit, understood, or at least he knew when to back off. He cleared his throat and retrieved the folder, masking his frustration with a thin smile. "If you change your mind," he said, tapping the folder's edge, "my number's the same." Leo didn't reply. The silence between them was enough. Voss left with a stiffness in his walk, the kind that comes from a man used to closing deals, not losing them. When the door shut, Leo leaned back in the chair, exhaling like he'd just come up from underwater. Mika sat beside him, arms still crossed but eyes steady. "That was something," Leo said, trying to sound light. Mika didn't smile, but his voice was even. "He doesn't get to take it." Leo turned to him. "Why not?" Mika finally looked at him. "Because someone left me a message here. And I'm not done listening." The words hit harder than Leo expected. There was no argument to make, no counteroffer that could match that kind of conviction. For the first time, it was clear. This wasn't just his call anymore. This place belonged to both of them now, and neither was ready to let go. By evening, they were back to tightening screws and replacing broken jacks. No fanfare, no triumphant music, just work. Steady, imperfect, real. Leo thought again about Edda's note, about staying when it hurts. He didn't know if he was ready to do that completely, but for once, he wasn't walking away. And Mika, quietly energized, seemed to be drawing something from the chaos, as if the mess itself made more sense to him than any clean slate ever could. They didn't talk about Voss again. There was nothing left to say. The sound of the tape still hung in the room, like a reminder that some voices don't go away. They wait. They linger until someone picks them up again. As they packed up their tools for the night, Leo glanced at Mika and realized he wasn't just building a repaired console. He was building presence, his own place in this world. And Leo wasn't just teaching his son signal paths. He was learning how to stop running. When they turned off the light, the tape was still on the table between them, not just an object anymore, a line that neither of them would cross without the other. They didn't talk about it much beforehand. No formal decision, no dramatic vote between father and son. It just happened, like breath after too much silence. Leo came in holding a borrowed generator in the back of his truck, grease still fresh on his hands, and Mika was already sorting cables like he'd known this was coming. They worked side by side without needing to narrate the moment. It wasn't about bringing the station back to life forever. It was just for tonight. One broadcast, one chance to hear something that wasn't static. They patched together a functioning signal path using mismatched cords, tape, and stubbornness. Leo climbed the antenna tower while Mika stood below, holding the flashlight steady despite the wind biting through his hoodie. At the top, Leo tightened the last bolt with frozen fingers and looked out over the prairie. It stretched endlessly, dark and open like a waiting question. When he descended, he didn't say anything. He just walked to the booth, sat down, and adjusted the mic. Mika took his seat beside him, headset on. Leo paused, took one breath, and spoke. "This is Station Kida," he said, voice gravel-thick. "If you're out there, we're listening." The silence that followed felt heavier than he expected. It stretched long enough to doubt, to regret, to almost reach for the power switch. Mika glanced at him once but didn't speak. His hands moved with focus, adjusting levels, watching the VU meters twitch with each ambient pop and hiss. Then finally, the phone rang. Once. A pause. Then again. Leo looked at Mika, who nodded, and he picked up the receiver. "Hello?" he said, unsure what version of himself he was using. On the other end, an older woman's voice trembled into the airwaves. "I thought no one was out there anymore," she said. "Thought maybe I was the only one left listening." Leo didn't answer right away. He just let her talk. She told a story about losing her husband last spring, about still cooking for 2 out of habit, about tuning into the station every night for decades, even after it went silent, just in case. When she finished, Leo thanked her. "You're not the only one left," he said. And the line clicked off, not in rejection, but like a boo. After that, the calls didn't stop. They came in slow at first, then picked up like a wave, one after another, people who hadn't heard their own names aloud in weeks, who remembered Edda's voice better than their neighbors. Teenagers sitting in parked trucks on gravel roads called in on speakerphone just to say they were bored and alive. A farmer thanked them for breaking the quiet. A nurse on the late shift cried softly while recounting how she used to listen between patients. One caller played harmonica live into the phone, and Mika laughed. The real kind, the kind that pulled his shoulders into it. Between calls, Mika dug through the tapes and played a few of Edda's archived soundbites, snippets of her laughing at her own jokes, reacting to callers yelling, "Hell no!" When someone tried to argue Elvis wasn't country, the warmth in her voice filled the room like she'd never left. Mika leaned closer to the console, tapping buttons with growing confidence, lips pressed into a soft smile. Leo watched him not as an engineer or a father or a man with regrets, but as someone finally here. Not running, not grieving, just present. Leo had expected to feel proud. He hadn't expected to feel lighter. There had always been a weight to fatherhood for him, especially after losing her. A weight of getting it right, of being enough, of not letting Mika slip into the same silences Leo had spent his life escaping. But in that moment, with his son running the board and the phone lines flickering like they had a pulse, Leo realized he didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to be. And somehow, that was enough. He turned toward the mic again, more comfortable now. "This isn't a show," he said on air. "It's just a light. If you see it, you're not alone." Mika didn't say anything, but his fingers brushed against Leo's hand as he reached for a volume knob. A small touch. Unscripted. Enough to tell Leo he wasn't just imagining the closeness. For once they were in rhythm, not just with the broadcast, but with each other. Eventually the calls slowed, the voices softened, and the station settled into a gentle hum. The broadcast was still going, but there was no need to fill every second. Between calls, they let the quiet stretch naturally, and it no longer felt empty. Mika leaned back in his chair, eyes on the meters, the same ones Leo used to watch at his age. He looked calm, at ease in a way Leo hadn't seen since before the hospital, before the funeral, before everything cracked. "You good?" Leo asked. Mika nodded. "Yeah," he said. "It feels like she's still here, you know." Leo didn't push for clarification. He didn't need to. He nodded once, more to himself than to Mika. "Yeah," he echoed. "It really does." For the first time, he didn't feel like he was chasing his son across an emotional canyon. They were sitting side by side, shoulder to shoulder, holding space together, not fixing, not forcing, just holding. As the last call faded and the static returned to the edge of the soundboard, Leo sat back and looked over at Mika. The boy's expression was soft, still, but not distant. He wasn't forcing a smile. He didn't have to. There was a glow there, faint but undeniable. A kind of quiet pride. Leo reached forward and slid a few of the faders down, letting the background hiss take over, and exhaled. That knot in his chest, the one he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying, eased just slightly. They had come here to sell a ghost, but now they were speaking through one. As Leo glanced toward his son again, he understood what the station had become. Not a burden or a relic, but a bridge between generations, between grief and healing, between silence and voice. The night they went back on air, they weren't just talking to strangers. They were finally speaking to each other. The shift in the sky wasn't gradual. It was abrupt, violent in its quiet. One moment the light was warm and golden, leaking lazily across the roof of the station. The next, it was bruised purple, a color Leo hadn't seen since childhood, when storms had names and grown-ups locked the windows before turning off the lights. He stepped outside and stared upward, arms folded, heart thudding with something older than fear. The air didn't move. It just held, like a breath waiting to be exhaled. "Something's coming," he muttered, mostly to himself. Inside, the radio hissed softly, no voices, no warnings. He checked his phone. No alerts. The weather app showed mild wind, no storm watch, no thunderstorm advisory, but the air told a different story, and so did the horizon. A grey wall of cloud, impossibly tall, textured like iron, had begun to rise behind the town. It didn't crawl forward. It climbed, swallowing light. Leo swallowed hard. He'd seen this before when he was 15, and they'd hidden under the station's floorboards while a funnel tore through the next county. That night had left dents in his memory. And now, with no sirens, no alerts, just that dead stillness, he felt it again, the instinct to run. Inside, he grabbed Mika's bag and tossed a flashlight into it. "We're leaving," he said, not waiting for a response. Mika looked up from the console, startled. "What?" Leo didn't pause. "Storm's coming. There's no warning system. Nothing's working. We'll drive west and get ahead of it." Mika stood slowly, his hands still resting on the edge of the board. "You said we'd fix it. You said we'd help people." Leo zipped the bag. "We can't help anyone if we're dead. This isn't a drill." He could already feel the wind beginning to push against the door, that first creeping gust that smelled like wet soil and something older. Mika didn't move. His face didn't crumple, didn't shout. Instead, he just looked at Leo, really looked, and something in that expression made Leo pause. It wasn't fear, it was disappointment, a quiet kind of resignation that came from knowing exactly what comes next. "You're doing it again," Mika said softly. Leo frowned. "Doing what?" Mika swallowed hard, jaw tight. "Leaving!" It hit harder than any thunderclap. Leo's grip on the bag loosened. For a second, Leo considered shouting, telling Mika this was different, telling him he was protecting him, but he knew how those words would land. He'd used them before, and every time they'd cost him a little more ground. So instead, he stood still, heart thudding, looking at the boy he'd spent years trying to protect by staying distant. Mika stepped toward the board again, ignoring the wind, the gathering noise from outside. "If we go, who tells them?" he asked. And the question wasn't rhetorical. It was an indictment. His hands moved to the knobs and sliders like they belonged there, like they were extensions of him. "The sirens aren't working. The phones are down. This place might be the only thing left with a voice." Leo didn't respond right away. He stared at his son, the way he stood straight, scared but grounded, and saw his own cowardice reflected back at him, not in accusation, but in contrast. Mika wasn't asking for safety. He was asking for meaning, for presence, for something earned. And Leo, who had always prided himself on knowing when to cut a line before it failed, realized that this was the moment not to pull away. "I don't know what to say," Leo admitted, voice raw. Mika didn't look at him. "Then just say what's true." He sat down and reached for the mic, hands steady even as the storm began to press louder against the walls. Leo stood frozen, watching the moment unfold like a scene he hadn't rehearsed for. This wasn't about the station anymore. It wasn't about old tapes or money or second chances. It was about right now. It was about a boy who had been spoken to but rarely heard, choosing to speak. Leo moved toward the console, slowly, like someone approaching holy ground. "You know how to route the feed through the backup generator?" he asked quietly. Mika gave a small nod. "Yeah, you showed me." Leo crouched beside the console, checked a few connections, and nodded once. "Then let's do it together." The words surprised even him. Not an order, not a correction, a collaboration. Mika's face didn't change much, but something in his shoulders eased. They leaned over the controls together, not as teacher and student, but as partners. The wind howled louder now, rattling the roof, making the windows shudder. But inside the booth they were focused. Hands moved quickly, testing levels, confirming signal output, reconnecting old equipment like it had been waiting for this moment. Mika set the mic between them. "Whenever you're ready," he said. Leo looked at the red light blinking on the console. They were live, no script, no plan, just presence. He cleared his throat. "This is Station Kida," he began, voice steady despite the weight of everything pressing in. "If you're hearing this, you need to find shelter. There's a storm coming fast from the east, and the sirens aren't working. We're gonna stay on the air as long as we can." He looked at Mika, who gave a nod. "We're here with you," Leo added. "You're not alone." The line held. The signal hummed. And something in Leo, something long buried beneath loss and silence, began to shift. Not all at once, but enough to stay. Enough to choose to stay. For the first time, Leo didn't run. He didn't pack the bag, didn't call Voss, didn't make excuses about safety wrapped in fear. He stayed. Because Mika stayed. Because this boy, who had every reason to be bitter and closed, chose instead to be brave. Leo watched him adjusting the board, eyes focused, expression calm. Not defiant, just present. And Leo realized the question Mika had asked wasn't just about the town. It was about them. If they ran, who told the truth of what they'd started here? Who carried the voices forward? Who chose to be more than survival? The storm outside didn't slow, but inside they were still speaking. And for the first time, the station felt not like a place that belonged to the past, but to the future they were deciding to build, one broadcast at a time. The tornado hit like a roar from the pit of the earth, not like a sound, but like a force tearing up from underneath them. The walls of the station trembled, the ceiling groaned as though it might split in two, and the floor beneath Leo's boots shuddered with a deep, trembling threat. The first blast of wind struck like a giant's hand, and Leo instinctively placed himself between the window and Mika, his body tensed, ready for impact. But they stayed on the air. Somehow. The generator kept humming, the board alive under their fingers. "This is Kida. If you're listening, don't wait for the sirens. They're down. Get to your basements, culverts, under stairwells, anything. Just get low and stay there." Leo's voice shook but didn't break, even though every cell in his body was screaming at him to grab his son and flee. Instead, he kept talking, because if he stopped, someone might not find shelter in time, and because Mika was watching him, not with fear, but with a strange steadiness that told Leo, this matters more than running ever did. Calls kept pouring in, each one sharper, more urgent. A woman trapped in a trailer near the edge of town sobbed into the receiver, describing how her door had already been ripped off its hinges. Mika jotted the address down with shaking hands, then passed it to Leo, who relayed it into the mic for emergency responders who might still be listening. Then an elderly man's voice cracked over the line. He couldn't move quickly enough to reach the cellar. He was sheltering under a heavy table and asking if someone could let his dog in from the yard. Mika's lips pressed tight, his pen hovering, and then, without needing to ask permission, he spoke into the backup mic for the first time. "If anyone near County Line hears this, check on 223 Ashwood. He needs help." His voice was clear, calm, deliberate. And in that moment, Leo saw something new in his son, something like purpose. No longer a boy waiting to be saved. He was showing up, not just for himself, but for strangers, for voices shaking in the dark. They barely had time to brace before the second wave hit. A sound like tearing metal ripped through the ceiling, followed by a dull thud that made both of them flinch. Then it happened. A cracking noise above, and before Leo could fully register it, part of the ceiling gave way. A wooden beam splintered and dropped like a guillotine through the air. Without thinking, Leo lunged, grabbing Mika and throwing them both to the ground. The beam struck the floor behind them with a shattering crunch, sending a shockwave through the room. Mika gasped, curled under Leo's arm, eyes wide with terror. But more than that, shock. Not at the storm, not even at the beam, but at his father's body shielding his. The look on his face wasn't confusion. It was revelation. As if for the first time, something that had never made sense now did. Leo didn't move for a long second. He held Mika close, breathing hard. "You okay?" he asked. Mika nodded wordlessly, and in that quiet, Leo knew the boy had seen it, the raw instinct, the love underneath all his silences. Not fear of fatherhood, not detachment. Just a man trying not to fail the person he loved most. They crawled back to the console, shaken but unbroken. Dust still floated in the air, but the equipment was somehow intact. The mic was still live, flickering its red light like a heartbeat. Leo sat first, voice hoarse now. "Keda is still here," he said, more to himself than the town. "We're still with you." Mika didn't wait to be invited. He sat down beside him, put on his headset and resumed his role without missing a beat. They continued broadcasting, directions to shelters, updates from listeners reporting damage, and moments of breath between warnings. At one point, a child's voice called in, whispering from under a bed. "I'm scared," the boy said. Mika leaned in. "Me too," he replied gently. "But we're gonna stay with you until it passes, okay?" The boy sniffled, then said, "Thank you." And Leo felt something in his chest break open and settle at the same time. His son, this boy he'd been so afraid of losing, was right here, offering comfort to strangers when the world was cracking apart outside. They didn't stop, not even when the windows rattled so hard it felt like they'd shatter, not when the power dipped again and again and the generator coughed and caught. They kept the feed alive, even if the signal warbled, even if their voices shook. For every call that came through, they held the line. Leo kept glancing at Mika, waiting for panic, for collapse, for the shutdown that grief had trained him to expect. But Mika didn't break. He scribbled down notes, passed Leo addresses, adjusted the EQ when the interference got too loud. He was working, not just like someone capable, but like someone who belonged here. Leo didn't interrupt that. He supported it, stepped back when Mika needed space, leaned in when he was asked. It wasn't control anymore. It was trust. And somehow that mattered more than any broadcast they'd ever done. The world might be unraveling, but in this booth, something was coming together. When the storm finally passed, when the howling quieted, when the rain turned soft instead of savage, when the last gust finally ran out of breath, they sat back, exhausted. The booth was a mess. The roof was fractured. But the station had survived. Scarred, but still breathing. Leo looked over at Mika, whose headset had slipped slightly off his ear. The boy was staring ahead, stunned but solid. "We made it," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Leo nodded. "Yeah," he replied. "We did." Outside, the town was torn open, roofs missing, streets flooded, debris scattered like stories ripped from the page. But inside that small, battered station, a signal had held. They had stayed. They had spoken. And in the middle of the worst night, they had helped someone feel less alone. That would never be forgotten. In the stunned days after the storm, the station became something it had never intended to be, a refuge. People came not for programming, not for music or chatter, but for connection. The building that had once felt like a ghost now pulsed with human need. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years sat shoulder to shoulder on the floor, passing water bottles, sharing chargers, trading updates about who was safe, who was missing, who needed medicine. Someone brought a crock pot. Someone else lit candles and set them along the windowsills like they were guarding sacred ground. It was messy, imperfect, too loud at times, but it felt alive. Leo moved through the space like a man waking up in his own skin. He helped patch a hole in the roof, passed out granola bars, and fixed a broken transistor radio for a kid who wouldn't stop crying. Mika was everywhere, recording messages, answering questions, reading updates on air in that calm, steady voice that had started to become familiar to more than just Leo. The storm had shredded homes, but it had left this strange, stubborn little outpost standing. And now people were beginning to treat it like a heartbeat they didn't want to lose. When Voss returned, he came alone and without ceremony, walking into the front room, with the stiffness of someone who didn't know how to navigate a place full of people instead of silence. His polished shoes looked ridiculous against the muddy floorboards. Leo saw him before he spoke and braced himself, already knowing what kind of speech was coming. "You've done a good thing here," Voss started, voice tight. "Really? But that doesn't mean you need to stay here. It's a property. It has limits. Eventually people will leave, and then what? You're not obligated to hold it together." He placed a new envelope on the counter. "My clients have revised the offer. Higher this time. A sensible choice for your son's future." Leo stared at the envelope, then at Voss, who was trying very hard not to look at the volunteers cleaning out the hallway, or the woman in the corner who had just reunited with her missing dog. "You still think this place is just a building," Leo said quietly. "It's not. It's witness. That's what Edda built. That's what these people are holding on to." Voss didn't argue. He just left the envelope behind, as if it might argue for him. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to sink behind the fractured skyline, Maribel appeared in the threshold like an echo. She didn't enter right away, just stood there with her arms wrapped around something heavy and metal, a small, dented lockbox. Leo called her in, and she crossed the floor without a word, setting the box down gently in front of him. "She asked me to hold it," Maribel said, her voice softer than usual. "Told me to wait until the boy comes home. Didn't make sense until now." Leo stared at the box like it might vanish if he touched it. Maribel nodded, then left without waiting for thanks. It took him a full minute to find the courage to flip the latch. Inside, nestled in a faded cloth, was a cassette tape. No label. But unlike the first, this one had a red mark drawn in the corner. Mika stepped up beside him silently, their shoulders brushing. Neither of them said a word as Leo carried it into the booth and slid it into the deck. His hands shook, not with fear, but with something deeper. Anticipation, maybe. Or the ache of finally knowing. He pressed play. Edda's voice came through again, this time steadier, as though she knew exactly what moment it would reach. "If you're hearing this," she said, "then the worst has passed. Maybe not the storm, but the silence." Leo's breath caught. Mika didn't move. "Mika," she continued, "you don't know me, but I knew of you. Your father was always running, but he never stopped writing your name in the margins. I hope you know that." Mika blinked hard, swallowing. "You've inherited something strange, I know. Not money, not land, But a place where people hear each other. That's rare. Don't let it slip away. The tape hissed for a moment, and then she spoke again. "Leo," she said, and the way she said his name made him sit straighter. "You left because you thought staying would kill you. But leaving is what made you hollow. Grief doesn't shrink when you run. It just finds you in quieter rooms." Leo clenched his jaw, trying to stay composed, but the words were surgical. Gentle, precise, devastating. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," she said. "You never did." He didn't cry right away. He didn't break in any cinematic way. There was no sob, no collapse, just a man sitting very still, his hands resting in his lap, his head bowed slightly like he'd finally been given permission to set something down. The room stayed quiet, as if honoring the weight of it. Mika didn't speak. He didn't shift. He simply leaned in closer than before until their shoulders touched completely. That was all. Not a hug. Not a scene, just contact, presence. And in that moment, Leo realized how many years he'd spent trying not to be seen when all Mika had wanted was to be known by him. He let out a slow breath, and it trembled at the edges. "She always knew how to get the last word," Leo whispered. Mika gave the barest smile. "Yeah, but this one was pretty good." They didn't move for a long time. Just sat there, the tape still spinning to its end, the static rising like dust, soft and unthreatening. For once, the silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like peace. People moved around them again eventually, refilling supplies, reorganizing cots, checking radio batteries. The station was still full, still humming. But inside the booth, time slowed down just enough. Leo didn't look at the envelope Voss had left on the table. He didn't need to. The answer had already been given, in the steadiness of his son's breathing beside him, in the voice of a woman who had loved them both without condition. The booth didn't need renovation to matter. It didn't need polish. It needed people, real ones, who showed up when it counted. And now it had them. Mika shifted slightly, but didn't pull away. "We're really staying?" he asked. Leo nodded. "Yeah," he said. "We're staying." And this time, he meant it, not as duty, not as surrender, but as choice, as home. Weeks later, the station no longer resembled the forgotten shell it once was. It didn't sparkle or shine. It was patched, uneven. Its walls still bore water stains, and some of the cables were older than Mika, but it pulsed with purpose. Volunteers had kept coming back, not because anyone asked them to, but because no one could quite stay away. Someone donated shelves. Someone else brought in an old but functional transmitter. A high schooler who'd grown up listening to Aunt Edda offered to paint the new logo by hand. Leo watched it all unfold with quiet awe, realizing that the only thing stronger than the storm had been the people left standing afterward. When Voss called one final time, sounding less confident than ever, Leo didn't even hesitate. He told him the answer was no. The station wasn't for sale. Instead, Leo walked into the county office with a folder full of signatures and filed a preservation agreement. The building would become an emergency hub, a community-run broadcast center, something living, not just protected. Signing those papers felt less like closing a deal and more like breaking a chain. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't running anymore. Mika, once the silent shadow behind Leo's footsteps, now walked with keys in his pocket and a quiet authority in his shoulders. He knew which fuse powered what. He knew which wires buzzed if you stepped wrong. And more than that, he knew the names of the people who stopped by. He remembered their stories. He greeted them with nods, with jokes, with a look that said he belonged here, not just as a tag-along, but as part of the very circuitry of the place. On the anniversary of Aunt Edda's death, they planned something special. Not a solemn tribute, but a show, her kind of show. No script, no schedule, just an open line and a welcome voice. As they went live that evening, Leo cleared his throat and said softly, "1 year ago today, the woman who built this place left us, but she didn't leave it empty." Mika sat beside him, headphones on, already cueing tapes. The lines lit up fast, callers sharing stories of Edda interrupting them, laughing too hard on air, playing Elvis 3 times in a row just to make a point. Each story was like a match struck in the dark. And together they kept the room warm. Some stories made them laugh, others made them pause. One man spoke through tears, recalling how Edda stayed on the line with his mother during a bad winter storm, just so she wouldn't feel alone. A teenage girl called in from the edge of town, saying she never met Edda, but still felt like she knew her. Every call stitched something tighter in Leo's chest. Less grief now, more thread. When there was a lull in the phones, Mika turned to him. "You gonna talk about Mom?" he asked. It wasn't pressure, it was invitation. Leo hesitated, then nodded. He leaned into the mic. "My wife," he began slowly, "used to say that silence is a room where grief breathes. I didn't understand that until I lost her." His voice trembled, but he didn't stop. "I tried to outrun the silence, to fill it with anything, but Edda, she taught me that sometimes you don't need to fix the silence. You just need to sit in it with someone else." He paused, looked at Mika, then added, "That's what this place has become. Not an escape. Just a room where people can breathe again." And this time, the silence that followed didn't hurt. As the show neared its end, Mika reached for a tape and glanced at Leo. No words, just a small smirk. Leo nodded, already knowing what was coming. The speakers crackled for a second, then filled with the sound of Edda's unmistakable laugh, full-bodied, unfiltered, the kind of laugh that left no room for pretending. The callers didn't speak. No one needed to. The whole town, it seemed, paused to hear that laugh again. Leo sat back, eyes damp, mouth curled into something softer than a smile. It wasn't that the grief was gone. It had just shifted. It no longer weighed the same. It had found room inside them without taking everything else away. Mika leaned closer. "She would have hated how sentimental this is," he whispered. Leo chuckled. "Yeah, she cut the feed just to spite us." They let the tape run until it faded to silence. And when it did, Leo didn't feel hollow. He felt held. He reached across and took Mika's hand, not tightly, not dramatically. Just enough. After the sign-off, people lingered in the station's front room. No one was in a hurry to leave. The night had settled deep, but the porch lights were still on, and someone had brought coffee in a thermos marked Edda's Blend. Leo stepped outside with a small wooden plaque in his hands, the nails already tucked into his pocket. Mika followed him, holding a hammer. They didn't speak as Leo held the plaque against the wall beside the studio door, reading the words carved into it. Edda's own scribble turned into something lasting. "Don't let the lonely talk into the dark." He held it in place while Mika hammered it into the siding, firm, deliberate, like he wanted it to echo. When it was secure, Mika reached into his jacket and pulled out a small strip of wood, something he'd carved himself. He knelt, affixed it beneath the plaque, and stepped back. The second line in Mika's uneven but confident writing read, "We're here." Leo stared at it, a lump forming in his throat. No ceremony, no speech, just truth nailed to a wall. And when Leo locked the studio door that night, it didn't feel like sealing something up. It felt like lighting a lantern, the kind you leave burning for someone who might be walking home. He stood there for a moment longer, keys in hand, staring at the door that had once felt like a barrier but now stood as a beginning. Beside him, Mika tugged at his sleeve. "Hungry?" Leo nodded. "Starving." As they walked down the steps, Leo glanced back one last time. The station wasn't perfect. It wasn't profitable, but it mattered. It breathed, it held stories, and now it held them too. The The station was no longer a place he had inherited. It was a place he belonged to. The silence would come again. Grief would visit again. But when it did, the light would already be on. Because they weren't running anymore. They were home. What did you think of Leo's choice to stay when everything inside him screamed to run, and of Mika's bravery to become the town's voice when the sirens failed? Leave your thoughts in the comments. On a scale from 0 to 10, what rating would you give this story? And which moment hit you the hardest, the unlabeled tape or the broadcast during the storm? Don't forget to subscribe to Deb's Story Haven and turn on notifications so you never miss another emotional story filled with secrets, second chances, and unforgettable endings.